Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. I'm here with Joe Cornish in his office up in Northallerton in North Yorkshire, and I've driven up here because we are putting together a charity print box to raise money for Mountain Rescue. And you might notice that Joe's in a neck brace because 6 weeks ago we had a bit of an incident on a workshop we were running together. So what happened, Joe?
On the descent from the summit of Culmore, and just at a very particularly steep part of the hill, I was hit by a really unexpected freak gust of wind. I would say it literally felt like I had a big hand on my backpack pushing me off the edge, and it was so steep I couldn't stop myself, so I tumbled quite a long way, totally out of control, and came to a halt with a lot of pain.
Yeah, miraculously, because I saw you fall and it was pretty horrifying, to be perfectly honest. You were going a little bit too fast, too steeply down that mountain. Yeah, horrible experience. And then everybody rushed to you to see what we could do for you. So, yeah, I mean, that kind of situation is just horrible to deal with. And I'm a mountain leader, so technically I'm trained to do that. I have my first aid training, but of course being in that situation for real is pretty scary regardless. So we actually had a GP in the group who helped with the assessment at the time, but it did turn into a full mountain rescue incident, talking to the emergency services, and then I got to see you whisked away in a helicopter.
Hopefully the only time that will have happened.
Yeah. Well, it was definitely a relief to see you, taken off the mountain, and then I walked down the mountain to meet the Assynt Mountain Rescue team with the group. But they'd actually orchestrated the Coastguard helicopter, and they were ready with further team members if the helicopter had been unable to land. So, we're pretty indebted to the Assynt Mountain Rescue team, really.
Yeah, we sure are. Yeah, it's fantastic, and I never thought I would need mountain rescue. I literally didn't. All the years and years, and I've been hill walking, and if you're confident in your agility and ability, you never expect it, but it does happen, and even the most experienced hill walkers and mountaineers can need their services sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's just as well to be reminded in that way.
I mean, one of the funny things telling my friends about what happened is that they know that you're in your 60s now, and they're like, oh, he's just taken a stumble, but Joe's actually more agile than me. I mean, I think Joe's seen me fall half a dozen times when we've been hiking together, and you're very fleet-footed, aren't you? So it really can happen to anybody. And that's why it's so important to do some fundraising. So that's what this print box is for. Yeah. And in this video, I'm going to take you through that production process. But we're here at the moment actually to sign this final stack of prints. Fotospeed very kindly provided thousands of sheets, 1,700 sheets of their platinum cotton paper, which makes this kind of thing possible, quite frankly. And
I think we cleaned out their stock.
Well, I mean, yeah, entirely, and just before Christmas as well. So, we can only really thank those guys for doing that, because
absolutely,
it makes a huge difference to us, but more importantly to Assynt Mountain Rescue Team, because how much money has this raised?
I think we're up to £23,000, and then gift aid on top of that.
Yeah. So it's basically more than a year's worth of fundraising for that volunteer-led mountain rescue team, and it saves them having to raise the money themselves. So thank you to everybody who has bought one of the 120 print boxes that Joe and I have been putting together over the last couple of days. But I thought I'd take you now back to my computer, and I'm going to talk you through how I edited these small prints. Just for those of you that might want to make a collection of prints yourself, I'll take you through a couple of images, and we can go into the detail of making a really nice print on this beautiful paper. I'm going to give you guys a couple of quick tips, quick being the operative word because I don't want this video to be too long, showing you how I produce prints and particularly smaller prints, and I'm going to go through two images just very quickly. So the first point is that when you're editing for print, you generally want things to be brighter, really as bright as you can without losing the essence of the image. So I'm going to switch the background color here to white, just so that we've got an impression of what the print will actually look like on white paper. And we can use a proof setup if we want to get a sense of what the image will look like when it's actually printed. And I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but you can select the particular paper profile on your printer and have that simulated with this preview button. It actually isn't showing too much difference here, but what I'm worried about is the flattening of the shadow areas at the bottom, and the proof does give you a sense of that, but really you'd have to make a hard proof to get a full sense of just how the detail might be lost in these shadow areas, and particularly on a matte paper. So that's the area that we're going to address, and we can actually go back and forth in the proof setup with Control Y. So I'll just turn it off for now, and I'm going to create a new curves layer and set a white point. So I'm clicking the Alt key and I'm dragging the white slider to the left, which will set a new white point for the image. And you can see that the sky is already clipped, the red channel. So actually we don't want to affect the sky, but it's at this point here that you start to see the edge of the cloud starting to clip. So we're just going to back off, and this is applying a brightening adjustment, but it's affecting the sky as well, which we don't want. So we're going to drag a gradient that protects the sky, if you like, so that that change doesn't happen there. And to me, this bit of mist now looks too bright relative to the sky, so we actually need to dial back this adjustment a little bit. So let's do it to 40%. That looks good. And we've made a decent change to the image, but it hasn't had too much effect on these really dark tones. So I'm going to create another gradient and another brightening curve. This time I'm just going to push the center of the curve up to really affect these dark tones down in the bottom left here. And if you don't know how the curves tool works and how masks work, then please do watch my separate videos on those subjects. So this is going to brighten up that bottom edge. We're going to then create a mask again over this bottom portion of the image, but lower down. And you can see just how much we've lifted the brightness in that bottom area. In fact, we probably lifted it too much. So again, we can just adjust the opacity, and that's those two changes together. So this is just giving us a slightly brighter area print that's going to look better in the various mixed lighting conditions that it might be seen in. On to the second image, and here we're going to talk about detail and sharpening specific to making these small prints. So I've actually already flattened the image down. We're going to duplicate the background layer so that we can sharpen on a new layer. And I'm also going to downsize the image. So we're going to choose image size, image size. And then I'm going to set the width at 230 millimeters, which is actually the size of the images on the paper that I printed for this print collection. And I'm going to choose a resolution here of 450 ppi. Now, most prints are done at 300 ppi, but the Canon Pro 1000 that I have, I can see ever so slightly more detail if I print at these higher ppi settings. So there's no benefit past 450 ppi that I could see, but there is a tiny benefit above 300. So that's why I've chosen that here. And resample automatic is fine because it will choose by cubic sharper. So that's our image downsized, and now we are ready to sharpen. And the key point here is when you're making tiny prints and you want the really fine detail to show through, be sure to over sharpen ever so slightly. So we're going to zoom in a lot here so that you can see what's going on if you're on a slightly lower res screen. And I'm going to use a coarse form of sharpening, the unsharp mask. So if you're making larger prints, Smart Sharpen is probably a slightly better tool, but Unsharp Mask is perfect here. And we're going to set the radius to 1 pixel because we care about every last bit of detail. And we're going to set the threshold. Let me just make the amount something really crazy. We're going to set the threshold to 3 or 4, and you can see that that will actually just reduce the amount of sharpening in the noisy areas whilst still sharpening the fine details, if you like, that have less contrast, like these crags here. And then we set an amount. Now this you have to get a bit of a feel for, but we set an amount that actually creates halos, but not excessive halos. So if I just turn this off, you can see there's no sort of fringing happening on these high contrast edges. Let's go really close up. If we go high, you can see this white edge on one side and a black edge on the other. That's a halo, and that's actually what we want. because when we print these pixels, they're actually only going to be 1/20th of a millimeter across, and there's going to be a bit of bleeding of the ink, so you're going to lose a bit of definition. So we want the original file to have excessive definition, excessive crispiness, because we're going to lose some of that in the print process. So if I zoom back out, you can, I don't know, have some sense of just how much I'm over sharpening it. In fact, I think it needs a little bit more. And then we click OK, and that looks pretty good, like it's going to print well to me. I do know there's a couple of areas here where the edge is just too high contrast, so we can go in with a layer mask here and paint black over those areas, just to make sure that they aren't excessively sharpened, because we don't need really hard edges in these sort of specific areas. But I will stop doing that, because I guess you get the idea there that you don't want to over sharpen areas that are already plenty sharp enough. So that's the pixel level sharpening, and that's exactly how I would make these smaller prints. It's going to produce a print which you can put your eye up to and still see detail. So hopefully that's helpful to you. And then it was time to do an enormous amount of printing, and the task became clear when the paper arrived from Fotospeed. It measured well above my waist in terms of the amount of paper. So 1,700 sheets, about 2 minutes per sheet, a little bit over. So that would take 60 hours of printer time, and I can only load 30 sheets or so into the printer at once, which did mean setting alarms in the middle of the night to get up and load the printer to make sure that I could get the printing done in about 3 days, ready to go up to Joe's to do the final part of the print box preparation. So it was, an enormous amount of time, and it was fine printing my own images, but printing Joe's was a little bit more daunting, particularly the image that you see here, because I think of this as an iconic image of Joe's, and it's this image and another that we're going to discuss now. Back in Joe's office now, and we're going to talk through a couple of Joe's prints as part of this print collection. So why have you picked these two, Joe?
Well, there's actually really, for me, interestingly, this is one of the first times I really spent a lot of time in Assynt, and this image was shot with a 5x4 inch ebony film camera in either 07 or 08. I think it was actually late 07. So 17 years ago, probably now. Mm-hmm. Anyway,
before I'd even started photography myself.
Exactly. Yeah. And memorable for all sorts of reasons. Mainly a lovely, an amazing day, but mainly it was the first time I'd been on this particular ridge, and I had no idea that I was going to find these extraordinary rock formations on that ridge, right at the point where I had pre-visualized in my mind from the map the position of the mountains in the distance. So that's what predicated the idea for going to this spot. So it was, in a way, you could say that this symbolized my kind of approach to mountain photography in the past. It was based on paper maps and quite careful planning. But of course, you can't plan the weather. So the weather is the weather. And also, what's interesting, this picture ended up on the cover of my book, Scotland's Mountains. But in recent years, I have so much more control over the interpretation of the image that there are a few tweaks that I can do on the file for the final print, which means that this is somewhat different in mood to the picture that's on the cover. Yeah, that's right,
because that cover is a little bit cooler, maybe more subdued.
Exactly. And this is more, in a way, it's a bit like any photographer kind of reinterpreting their archive many years later, where you were away from the actual experience, and you have a much more collective memory of your experience of the landscape, and you bring that to the image as opposed to the immediate memory of the day.
Well, and it's also great that you've had all of these developments in technology as well, so it becomes much more feasible to actually realise what you want with the final image, because of course film was a bit more restrictive in that respect.
It was, and yet there's still a surprising amount of flexibility. So by comparison, this image was the most recent picture I've shot with my big camera, and it was literally the last exposure before the descent when I had the accident.
Was it worth it?
Well, I mean, I'll leave that for others to judge. But I mean, I love it, and as I think we've said, I bear the mountain no ill will. It's just one of those things that happens, isn't it? So
Joe's already planning his return to Colmore.
I am. We've got to go back.
Yeah.
But again, another extraordinary place in these mountains where the rocks have a kind of unique character, and they're fascinating from a form point of view. And so again, I feel that what's fascinating, at least what I find fascinating, is that there is a small difference in the interpretation. Some of that could be down to the camera itself, the techniques used, but I think there's much more in common with these two than there is difference, as it were. Perhaps some of the colour in the earlier version goes back to the fact that those films had a very strong colour signature.
Yes.
Whereas perhaps these days with the raw file you have a softer and kind of more malleable colour palette. And I think that at the moment my tendency is to interpret that experience in quite a subdued way, maybe for emotional reasons. So it's a little bit more knocked back in colour. But the sense of form, place, depth, space, the combination of the foreground elements, which are tactile and give you the sense of being there, and then the sense of the landscape unfolding beyond, the sense of space, the sense of an adventure, and the beauty of the landscape is there. And it's long been one of my goals to try to synthesize those two elements together.
Yeah, and you've become quite good at it over the years.
I couldn't possibly say.
Yeah, but we did have an hour and a bit on the mountain, didn't we? Sort of waiting in the cloud and just hoping for this break, and then it did finally came, which was.
And that's true. Of course, what you don't see is those sort of the hour and a half where actually just whirling cloud and nothing else.
Yeah, that's right.
And then when it did break, it was remarkable, and it didn't last long, did it?
No, although the light that happened after your fall was quite good.
Don't get me started.
No, so I mean that's a nice print to include in the print set, because it does sort of bring home the reality of what did unfortunately happen on that day. But thanks for going through those too, Joe.
Pleasure, good fun.
Joe and I checked and signed every single image, and also signed a contact sheet which gave a bit more information about us and the images in the print collection. And that took a lot of time in its own right, so I'm glad we didn't have to write the captions, which we actually superimposed onto the image and then printed out to save us a little bit of time. And then we had to put the collections together, which again took longer than we expected, and we were very fortunate to have the help of a few people along the way, without whom we probably wouldn't have got it completed on time. And this is actually Ian, who was with us on Colmore when Joe had his accident, but we did get everything done. Here is the final foiled print box that we bought from the Tiny Box Company, and inside is a custom insert which Johnson's of Nantwich donated, so thank you very much, Johnson's, and particularly John McMillan. We have 13 sheets of just smaller than A4 platinum cotton paper. That's from Fotospeed, and this is the paper that Joe and I use for our exhibition prints and for the prints that we send out to customers. It's a beautiful paper, but it's not a cheap paper, and Fotospeed have been incredibly generous in donating retail value of about £3,000 or $4,000 worth of paper to make this print box happen. And without their donation, Joe and I simply would not have been able to do as many print boxes as we did. So they are an enormous contributor to this project. So thank you very much. That's very kind of Fotospeed, and thank you to everyone who donated. I hope you've enjoyed your print boxes and you've made a huge difference to these fantastic mountain rescue teams. In this case, the Assynt Mountain Rescue Team, but of course we'd like to thank all of the mountain rescue teams around the UK.